This presentation was recorded on Menang Noongar Budja, and I respectfully acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of this land, the Menang people of the Noongar Nation. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, to the diversity of First Nations people, and to their ongoing culture and connection to Budja. They were the first in this country to hold information and privacy sacred. Sovereignty has never been ceded. It always was and always will be Aboriginal land. The content that follows is based on the presenter's experience and understanding, and this video does not constitute legal advice. Organisations that are subject to the Australian privacy principles are encouraged to seek appropriate legal advice to understand their obligations and ensure adherence. Welcome to this video, part 3 of the eSafety for Non-Profit series. In this video we will be talking about your legal obligations towards ensuring the security of data in your care. In Australia, the most significant law that covers the protection of information is the Australian Privacy Act 1988. As of 2024, this Act is in the process of undergoing a major review, but has been consistently updated since it was signed into law in 1988 to ensure it continued to meet the needs of Australians and the pace of technological change. To make the Act easy for private sector organisations to understand and apply, it includes the Australian Privacy Principles, a set of 13 rights, obligations and methods which are the embodiment of the Privacy Act. For the most part, these are designed to be applied to organisations, including not-for-profits, who either exceed $3 million of annual turnover or meet certain other criteria about the sorts of information they deal with. Even though they are expressed as principles, they are as legally binding as the rest of the Act. The biggest criteria that governs whether an organisation needs to adhere to the Australian privacy principles is annual turnover. If your organisation is turning over more than $3 million per year, regardless of whether you are a for or non-profit organisation, you must implement the principles. If not, there are other criteria to check. For example, if you are a health service provider, if you directly trade in personal information, run a tenancy database, or are related to a business covered by the Privacy Act, then you will also be required to adhere to the principles. You can also simply opt in to follow the principles, and if you're not sure or are on the cusp of moving into one of the covered categories, then it may be worth following them anyway. There are 13 privacy principles, and they are generally grouped into 5 parts. The first 2 principles cover the considerations you need to make with regards to your organisation and the people you deal with. As an organisation operating under the Australian privacy principles, which within the Act is often called an Australian Privacy Principles Entity or APP entity, you must commit to managing personal information in an open and transparent way, so that anyone who deals with your organisation can find out what you're doing with their data if they so wish. Mostly that means you need to make sure you're following the principles, but also ensuring you have a privacy policy that's available free of charge to anyone who wants it. The second principle allows for anyone who deals with your organisation to choose to decline to give their identity or to choose to use a pseudonym unless your organisation can't legally or reasonably operate without their actual identity. The second group of 3 privacy principles deal with how and why your organisation collects the data it does. Privacy Principle 3 covers the collection of information, specifically solicited information, that is, information that you have expressly requested or taken active steps to collect. Some examples might be a form a new customer fills out when they engage your organisation. There's an important distinction in this section too about agencies, typically government entities or someone acting on behalf of the government, and organisations, which is every other entity covered by the APPs. Agencies are allowed slightly more leeway in terms of being able to collect information directly related to what the organisation does. When you're collecting sensitive information, if you need a refresher on the distinction, check back to video 1, you also need to record specific consent for that. For all the information you collect, you're required to make sure you collect it only in a lawful and fair means, so no subterfuge or trickery, and directly from the individual unless you can prove that it would be unreasonable to do so. The fourth privacy principle covers the scenario where your organisation finds itself with information it shouldn't have. This is actually quite likely. For example, someone might accidentally email information to you, or you might find that the forms you are using to collect information inadvertently reveal something about your customers that you hadn't specifically asked for. Dealing with the information comes down to referring back to the third principle and asking, could I have got this information if I had solicited it properly? If so, you can use the APPs to govern how you handle the data as if you'd collected it normally. Otherwise, you need to quickly destroy that information or otherwise render it non-identifying unless there's a legal reason you can't. The last privacy principle within this grouping deals with notifying individuals that their data has been collected. This doesn't include just making sure they are aware it has happened. Part of the distinction of soliciting personal information is doing so in a way that the individual is aware, but also ensuring that they have access to all necessary details of the collection process, what their data will be used for, how it will be stored, etc. You need to ensure that if you can't give them this information at the time you are collecting their data, then you can do so as soon as you're able afterwards, for example, a summary email. The most comprehensive grouping of the privacy principles is, unsurprisingly, that which governs how to deal with information you've collected, what you can use it for, who you can share it with, what sort of other data you can associate it with. Privacy Principle 6 says that, of the information you collect, you need to ensure that it's being used for the same purposes that it was originally collected, which will have been disclosed to the individual as part of APP 5. This is allowed to change, however, if it's an obviously related purpose that the individual would expect, if you ask them for consent directly, or if there's a legal reason the use case might have changed. There are many exceptions as well, more than are listed here, but some might include acting on suspected unlawful activity, preventing a threat which might hurt someone, or both. Direct marketing is a topic that is fraught with potential issues, and as such, it is given its own privacy principle. Again, for the most part, this principle is built around the same common sense ideas that a customer or user needs to be cognizant that their information will be used for marketing purposes. This is best done up front, but if this is unreasonable, then they need to be provided with a way to opt out of any future communications, and they need to be provided with the source of that information if it's requested. In an increasingly global world, data will frequently cross international boundaries. For example, some of the largest cloud data storage organizations in the world, Amazon AWS, Google Cloud, Microsoft Azure, are companies incorporated in the US but with data centers around the globe, including Australia. The company that provides your customer relationship management system might, similarly, be an international company, and thus you have responsibilities under APP 8 about how you work with those organizations. While it's not always the case that you will be responsible for data breaches or loss by international recipients, it is absolutely a possibility. The best way to show due diligence is to ensure the entity is either bound by the Australian privacy principles, for example due to operating in Australia, or will provide a comparable level of privacy protection. If you can't get that assurance, you must either get consent from the individuals whose data you are collecting, or, ideally, rethink whether you can afford to deal with the overseas entity. Australian Privacy Principle 9 deals with a particular specific scenario, ensuring that you don't associate the information you collect with government-issued identifiers. While you can generally collect some government-issued ID as long as the remainder of the privacy principles are upheld, you are not allowed to use government identifiers, for example a Medicare number, driver's license number, Centrelink ID, as an identifier on your own system. It might be tempting when you are creating your own data storage system to use the unique numbers the government has already given to your customers as an identifying key in your new system. This privacy principle forbids doing so. Once information is in your care, you have two responsibilities within the privacy principles: ensuring it is correct and ensuring it is safe. The next principles cover the integrity of your held information. Privacy Principle 10 deals with the quality of personal information you receive. It is your responsibility to ensure the data in your care is accurate, up to date, and complete. Normally, your organisation is encouraged to confirm this both at the point the data is collected and then again at the point where it is being used, especially when the information is being used for decision making. It can also minimise future issues if you subject this data to a periodic auditing and updating process. The 11th privacy principle is probably the one that is most relevant to this video series and broadly requires you to ensure you are taking reasonable steps to protect the data in your care. That means protecting it from misuse, interference, loss, and unauthorised access, modification, or disclosure. How this is done is largely dependent on the information you are managing, but could involve physical, electronic, and/or procedural safeguards, and ensuring you destroy or de-identify data once you have finished with it. The final pair of principles cover how any individual who has provided information to you can request access to that information and how and when they can keep that information up to date. The 12th privacy principle gives every individual whose data you hold the right to know what information you are storing about them. Anybody can request this information, and you must generally respond promptly, fairly, and without charging for that access. However, there are caveats, as the Freedom of Information Act 1982 must also be taken into account, as well as circumstances such as whether such disclosure might cause harm in and of itself. The final privacy principle ensures that the data that you store about an individual can be corrected if they request it to be, or if you find that it is incorrect by some other means. Your privacy policy generally should outline the method by which people can request this sort of update, and while there are situations where corrections can be refused, your organisation must provide a written explanation if this is the case. Just a reminder that while I have endeavoured to ensure the content of this video and my interpretations of the privacy principles are correct, they are my own interpretations and do not take into account your particular scenario. As such, I encourage you to seek appropriate legal advice on how to implement the APPs correctly in your case. Thank you for watching. In the next video, we will address your obligations when something goes wrong.